Okay, Assalamualaikum and good day to all of the students. As for today, we are going to look into new topic for RES 551 subject entitled the Development Appraisal. So as far as concerned, this topic cover the aims of development appraisal, and then we look into the methodology or calculation that has been used to estimate the development potential or development appraisal of a certain development project. In this context, we are going to use the discounted cash flow approach, such as the net present value, internal rate of return, and the second one would be the payback period by period approach. So without further ado, I am Dr. Wan Hishamuddin and I'm going to be your instructor for today. Let us look into the introduction. Why do we need to conduct development appraisal? Okay, first and foremost, development appraisal is one of the tasks that is needed to determine the financial viability for a certain development project. So before we conduct or we proceed with any types of development, we need to identify first whether the site has the potential to be developed from the financial perspective. So development appraisal is generally focusing on the financial perspective or financial performance of a certain development project in terms of the ability to generate income, to generate capital appreciation from this certain particular project. Okay, the second one would be development appraisal helps in making a critical decision. So critical decision in this context, whether to proceed with the plan development, or probably you need to make any changes to existing development plan that can hinder the viability or the performance of a certain development project. And the third one would be we are conducting financial viability to reduce the risk. As far as concerned, real estate development consists of various types of risk, internal and external risk, especially that related to the financial. Okay, and then the third one would be it is also helps in making a decision making for critical decision making, whether to proceed with this project or not to proceed, or maybe we can make any changes or any plan, changing of plan. Okay, the fourth one of the very fundamental difference, the biggest fundamental difference between real estate valuation that we have already learned last week as to compare with today's lecture, which is on the development appraisal, is this one. Valuation, the aims is to estimate the market value of site, while the appraisal is conducted to determine the developer's profit and financial viability. So the student needs to remind this because most of the exam question or the assessment normally do not give any of the indication whether you are going to conduct valuation or appraisal. So there are a few tips or key word that can be used to determine whether the question is for valuation or the appraisal. So after this, I will explain it further. Okay, and then next slide shows the objective of the development appraisal. So consider yourself, you have been given a vacant development site, for instance, as shown in the diagram or pictures. So a client has instructed you to conduct a financial viability for a proposed development project on a piece of development land. Okay, apart from residual approach that you have already learned from different lecturers, you can also conduct cash flow approach. Okay, let me show you the viability measurement for residual first. Okay, for residual approach, the calculation is very useful to determine the developer's profit, ratio of developer's profit from GDP, and ratio of developer's profit from CDC. So as far as concerned, residual approach only provide 3 measurement criteria. So that's where the cash flow approach comes into hand, whereby it helps to provide more and detailed estimation or results to support the 3 results obtained from residual approach. So we use discounted cash flow approach first to generate or to produce net present value. So net present value, as far as what we have already learned previously, is that there are 3 measurements of NPV. Positive NPV indicates that the project is good. Negative NPV indicate that project is not well or not so good. The 0 NPV is no gain, no loss situation. So in this context, we will look into the positive NPV so as to determine whether the project is viable or not viable. Okay, the second one would be the internal rate of return. Internal rate of return can be defined as the rate or rate of income that can internally generate from this particular project. So within the development project itself, we would definitely compare IRR with 3 types of rate. First is borrowing cost rate. The second one is the opportunity cost rate. And the third one would be the target rate of developer. So borrowing cost rate is basically the interest rate that has been given by the financial institution. The opportunity cost rate, on the other hand, is let's say we have 2 alternatives for investment. So if we sacrifice one investment as we go into the other one, so what is the rate of the sacrifice or the opportunity cost that has been lost? Okay, the third one would be the target rate of return. So normally rate of return by the developers as expected. So as a developer, normally they will give you a certain amount of target rate of return, for example 20% for this particular project. So we would definitely compare with the IRR. So if the IRR is larger than the 3 types of rate, then we can consider it as a viable project. Okay, the third one is in terms of the payback period. So payback period, as we have already learned last week, is a method that normally accumulated interest at the beginning of a project, certain development project, period project. So we will pay all the interest in the beginning of the period, and then the interest will start to reduce gradually until at the end of the project period we will no longer have to pay interest. So at the end of the project period, we will only need to pay the principal amount that we have borrowed. So that is the period by period principles. Okay, and then last but not least, we need to also estimate the developer's profit at the end of the project period. So to achieve these results, we can also use the DCF NPV and also the payback period. Okay, so the question is, how do we determine whether the proposed project is financially viable? So we will use all these measurements to determine the viability of a measurement, the viability of a certain project. Okay, let me show you the detailed explanation in regards to the approaches that we use in development appraisal. Okay, first is the discounted cash flow approach. So discounted cash flow approach can be defined as an approach that seeks to estimate the present value of or worth of the project. So it will generally bring presently all the future value that are generated from the cash flow. So generally we will use 2 criteria, net present value and internal rate of return. Okay, next. So net present value is derived by summating the results of discounting to the present day. As what I have already explained to you, we will summating all the results into the net present value, and then the amount of NPV is generally the amount of developers profit in today's or the current time of the period. So if the NPV value is positive, the project is financially viable, whereby the project will benefit exceed the cost, taking into account the opportunity cost. So if we read on the slide shown, positive NPV equals to good investment. So example, project A, GDV is 10 million. On the other hand, the total development cost or TDC is 12 million. And then you estimate the NPV, you'll get around negative 300k. So is it considered a good project or not a viable project? I believe that this is not a very viable project because it generates a negative NPV. Okay, let us look into the project B. So GDV is RM 20 million, while the TDC is 10 million. And then we calculate the NPV, net present value, it will derive at 8 million. So NPV positive of 8 million is considered a very good project because it produced positive NPV. Okay, project C, apart from project A and project B, we have project C. So this is a very unusual project. So you get GDV of 30 million, you calculate TDC is 30 million. This is just a example. And then you will get net present value of 0, no gain, no loss. So as far as concerned, can we say that project C is viable or not viable? Or this is normally for public project, government project, such as building school, building clinic, police station, and etc. Okay, this is the explanation for the net present value. Okay, if the NPV is negative, the project is not financially viable, since the return on investment is lower than the opportunity cost of capital or the cost of borrowing. That is the explanation for the net present value. And then we look into the calculation for NPV for development appraisal. So we have about 4 steps that we need to follow. First step, we need to estimate the net cash flow first. The second step would be to estimate the discount factor, 1 over A. A equals to 1 plus I% to the power of N. So as you can see here, within my Excel sheet, I put the negative sign in front of the N period because I want to simplify the calculation without using 1 over A. So I just put negative sign in front, and then you will get the amount of discount factor per quarter. Okay, and then you will have to estimate the PV of cash flow by multiplying between net cash flow and discount factor. And you will get the PV of cash flow for each of the period. Okay, step 4, you need to estimate the net present value. How do we estimate the NPV? Is by summating the value that we get from the PV of cash flow here, from period 0 to period 4. Okay, and then we will get the net present value. Okay, before I forget, there are very significant differences between market valuation or the valuation for project and also development appraisal. First is in terms of the period. So as you can see here, in the development appraisal, we need to put 0 period within the cash flow. So 0 period is tailored into the process of pre-development, whereby we need to find land for our development, and also we have to pay for the acquisition cost. So you will have to put land cost and acquisition cost within the period 0 or the pre-development period. On the other hand, within the development valuation, you will start at period 1 because you have already bought the site, and then you just have to estimate the market value of site. That is the major difference between development appraisal and development valuation. Okay, and then we look into the internal rate of return, IRR. So the IRR is the actual return on capital to be obtained from an investment. So in this context, we can also define IRR as the return on investment, ROI, rate, return on investment rate in terms of rate. This is the rate that is generated internally from the income and expenditure incurred. Therefore, it is called as internal rate of return. So as a common sense, since our projected cash flow consists of monetary items or monetary amount, cash inflow and cash outflow, so the working out between the cash inflow and cash outflow internally can produce the IRR. Okay, the third one, it is the discount rate at which the NPV of the income equals the NPV of expenditure, or in other words, the discount rate which produces a nil NPV. So this is the third explanation can be summarized as follows. So in order for you to get the actual internal rate of return, you need to set up or you need to develop one cash flow using one specific rate that can produce 0 NPV. Okay, so in principle, IRR equals to NPV equals to 0. So that is the principle of IRR. So in this context, you can calculate IRR using the Excel function. You can also use the formula manually, and also you could grab your graph paper, grab your ruler, and you could use the linear interpolation to estimate the IRR. Okay, the first one is using the manual formula. So IRR can be obtained using the formula of R1. R1 plus R2 minus R1 times NPV R1 divided by NPV R2 plus NPV R1. So in this context, you have to develop two types of or two cash flow. One cash flow using R1 that can produce positive NPV. The second one is R2 using rate number 2 that can produce negative NPV or NPV R2. And then you put all the amount or calculation within this formula, and then you will get the IRR. Okay, it uses the interpolation formula. Okay, another approach to calculate the IRR is using the linear interpolation. So this is what I have mentioned before. You have to get yourself a graph paper and a ruler, and then you have to search using the graph paper. Okay, as far as what we can see in this slide, so our IRR is a rate that stands between R1 and R2, and then as you can see, it will produce NPV 0. So when we interpolate or using linear interpolation, so IRR will be estimated at this rate or at this interpolation. And then you have to search what is the rate over here of the investment project. But I'm not going to emphasize on using the linear interpolation. So in this subject, IRR is measured using the Excel function, using the manual calculation or formula. Okay, let us look into the internal rate of return using Excel. Okay, as I've mentioned before, you have to search for R1 that can produce NPV R1 positive, and then R2 positive that can produce NPV negative. Okay, using the same cash flow, using the same calculations that we need to get the PV of cash flow, you will have to estimate both figures, NPV plus and positive NPV and negative NPV, R1 and R2. Okay, and then we transfer into the formula, so R1 and R2. So you apply this formula to get the IR. Then the last calculation or the figures that appear after you calculate using this formula is the rate of internal rate of return. So the rate will be used to estimate or to determine whether the project is viable or not viable in terms of financial viability. Okay, the second approach that we will use within this development appraisal is the payback period by period approach. Okay, as to compare with the DCF approach, payback period by period can be defined as approach that using the accumulated interest. And then this kind of approach are also quite complicated compared to DCF, whereby it uses the capital outstanding from previous period, capital outstanding, and then it will also use the interest, simple interest calculation. Okay, the period by period cash flow approach can also be used to assist in decision making. So among the criteria that are used is the payback period. So these are the criteria that we use to determine whether the project is viable or not from the PBP approach perspective. Okay, first we look into payback period. So is this project can generate more capital to pay debt, and the length of time required for an investment to recover its initial outlay. So in this, it can be summarized as a period that we can use the income to pay all the costs or the positive cash flow. Okay, the second one is the developer's profit at the end of the project. We can also calculate developer's profit using PBP approach. Let me draw your attention to the next slide. Okay, this method possesses two main advantages. Okay, first, you may get the actual amount owed at any point during the development process. So let's say if you want to know the total of debt in period 3, so payback period will provide that kind of amount for you to refer. Okay, if a change in interest occurs during the development process, this can be easily be incorporated. So let's say if the bank changes the amount of interest, so we can simply change the interest. For example, period 1 and period 2, the interest is around 7%. And then period 3 to period 4, the bank decide to change the interest into 8%. So we can simply change the interest to recalculate all the amount or the projected amount of cash flow. Okay, the third one, this method is probably most used in residential development where sales are phased, and it is important to know the precise point at which loan is repaid. Okay, so using the payback period, we know what amount of loan is repaid at a certain period of time, and also the change of interest within the period. Okay, this is the 2 or 3 advantages of the payback period. Okay, this one I type 2. So basically it has 3 main advantages. Okay, let us look into the calculation. for payback period. Okay, within the payback period, you need to know the elements that make the calculation for this particular approach. Okay, first you need to have the capital outstanding from previous period. Okay, capital outstanding from previous period is generally accumulated debt or capital outstanding that recorded from the previous period. For example, let's say if you want to calculate the capital outstanding for period 1, so capital outstanding from period 1 is generally a capital outstanding generated in quarter 0. So we brought forward the capital outstanding into capital outstanding from previous period in quarter 1. Okay, and then you need to also calculate the interest per quarter using simple interest. You multiply the interest with the principals. And then last but not least, you need to calculate the capital outstanding or the accumulated debt for each of the period. Okay, the step that you need to follow is that first, you will estimate the net cash flow. Okay, we refer to period 0. You calculate the net cash flow for period 0. Okay, because period 0 don't have any amount of capital outstanding from previous period, so you just put nil or dash. And then period 0 also does not have any interest, you put dash. And then you bring the net cash flow into capital outstanding cell. Okay, and then we move into period 1. So to estimate the capital outstanding from previous period 1 in period 1, you have to bring the capital outstanding period 0 to 1, capital outstanding from previous period. So you can refer this one. Okay, you brought forward capital outstanding from previous period 1, and then you have to multiply the capital outstanding from previous period 1 with interest. Okay, let's say the interest per quarter is 2.41%. So you will have to multiply the principal amount in capital outstanding from previous period with the interest per quarter, and then you will get the amount of interest per quarter. So the next step would be step 5, whereby you multiply, whereby you have to sum all the amount from net cash flow until interest per quarter, and then you will get the capital outstanding. And then the process repeat itself, where you have to bring forward the capital outstanding to quarter 2. So it will become a capital outstanding from previous period in quarter 2, and then you have to multiply the interest per quarter, so you will get the amount of interest per quarter. Then you total up net cash flow until interest per quarter, and you will get the capital outstanding. So the process will repeat until at the end of the period 4. So the final amount of capital outstanding at the end of the project period constitute a developer's profit at the end of project period. So let's say you generate an amount of 20 million. So 20 million is considered as the surplus or profit that can be obtained if we proceed with this type of development. So these are the profit that can be used to estimate the ratio from GDP, and then we could also use this profit to estimate ratio from TDC, so as to determine the viability measurement of a certain development project. Okay, these are the detailed explanation: step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, step 5, and then you have to repeat the whole process for quarter 2 and next and beyond. So you may read it here. Okay, and then I have to give you the summary. So once you have already completed the calculation, DCF and PVP, you may produce this kind of table to summarize your finding. Okay, first, using the discounted cash flow. So the measurement criteria that we use is NPV, net present value. So viability measurement is positive NPV equals to viable investment. And then the second one would be NPV IRR. IRR is greater than the borrowing cost rate and target rate of return. So we call it as a viable investment. Furthermore, we use the payback period by period. So within the payback period by period, the measurement criteria are as follows. First, we use the payback period. Okay, shorter the recoupment period, better is the investment. So the common sense is the faster we pay our debt, better is our income flow or our financial capability. Okay, the second one would be developer's profit at the end of the project period. So to justify whether our profit is viable or not, we need to do the ratio from GDV and TDC. And then once you get the ratio, so we will have to compare with the viability measurement, whereas for GDV is between 15 to 25%. On the other hand, for total development cost is between 20% to 50% and above. So if you get within this range, so we can simply consider this project as a viable development project. Okay, next is exercise 1. So you can do at home. You have to recreate this cash flow, and then you have to estimate the financial viability using DCF or discounted cash flow approach NPV, discounted cash flow IRR, and also you have to use PBP method to estimate this project financial viability. So this is a very brief cash flow. So we have all the elements of development, starting from land costs, we have pre-development costs, construction costs, we have construction costs, and also last but not least is post-construction costs such as advertising, project management, contingencies, and etc. Okay, as a conclusion, what can we say about development appraisal? So development appraisal is basically a very significant task or significant exercise that needs to be conducted before we decide any types of development project or we proceed with development project. Why? Because we need to identify the financial capability of a certain project even before the project started, to avoid any risk or to avoid unsold development project. We need to also conduct the performance measurement to identify whether these types of project can sustain or sustainable in the market, to avoid any oversupply and then lack of demand. And also we need to look into the external factors such as COVID-19, disruptive technology, for example, because it will generally affect our future capability. Okay, the second one, to recap back, we need to use two approaches of cash flow, such as discounted cash flow approach, net present value, and period by period, payback period by period. And the measurement criteria that has been used are generally to assess the decision maker for a development project in financial decision, whether to proceed with the project, whether to make amendment on the certain specific or characteristic that can hinder the project success, and also to avoid or to minimize risk that engulfing certain development project. Okay, last but not least, cash flow method is much needed to provide an extensive estimation, because residual method can only provide a very limited results and calculation. Therefore, we need to have cash flow method to assess or to back up the results from the net present value, internal rate of return, and also from the recoupment period of a certain project. So that's all for today's lecture. So hopefully you can do my exercise or tutorial that has been provided within this slide, and see you next time.